The bar disappeared at 11:47 a.m. Somewhere between mile marker 6 and a rotting wooden sign that read Crows. Tooth PEAK 4.2. I remember the exact time because I glanced at my phone just as the last signal bar flickered out. Like a candle surrendering to the wind, I remember thinking, good. That's the whole point. My name is Ethan Voss, and I was 29 years old when I made the worst decision of my life. Let me be precise about what I mean by worst decision. I don't mean quitting my marketing job in Seattle. I don't mean selling my apartment or donating 3/4 of my furniture to strangers online. Those were calculated risks, the kind that look reckless from the outside but feel like surgery from the inside. You cut away the dead tissue. You breathe through the pain, and you hope the body knows how to heal. No, the worst decision wasn't any of that. The worst decision was choosing to hike the Calic Ridge Trail alone in late October. With a weather window that my brother Marcus had already called criminally stupid over the phone the night before. Just wait until I get back from Portland, he'd said. 2 weeks. The trail will still be there. I need this now, I told him. And I meant it in the way that people mean things when they're running from something and trying to dress it up as moving toward something. The truth was simpler and darker. Alina had left 4 months ago, quietly, efficiently, the way she did everything, and I had spent those 4 months watching myself dissolve into the kind of person I didn't recognize in mirrors. I stopped cooking. I started drinking just enough to sleep, but not enough to feel anything different. I scrolled through old photographs on my phone at 2 a.m. like a man pressing on a bruise to make sure it still hurt. I needed the trail the way you need cold water when you're running a fever. Not because it would cure anything, because it would remind me that my body was still real. So on the morning of October 23rd, I parked my truck at the Calic Ridge trailhead, laced up my boots, adjusted my 40-liter pack, and walked into the Douglas fir forest as though I owned the decision. The first 6 miles were everything I'd hoped for. The trail wound upward through stands of ancient fir and hemlock, the bark of each tree so deeply furrowed it looked like wrinkled skin. Patches of old snow clung to the north-facing slopes, hard and blue-white in the October light. My breath plumed in front of me. My legs remembered how to work in unison with my lungs. And there was something profoundly satisfying about that. The body's unconscious competence. The way muscle memory carries you when your mind has forgotten how to. I listened to the forest. Not music, not a podcast. The forest itself, the faint creaking of branches in the wind, the distant percussion of a woodpecker working high on a dead snag, the occasional whisper of small animals retreating through the underbrush. A Clark's nutcracker shrieked overhead, dove between the trees, and was gone. I started to feel the tight coil behind my sternum begin to loosen. 1 millimeter at a time, but it was loosening. That was when I noticed the first strange thing. At roughly mile 7, the trail crossed a narrow ridge, a rocky spine maybe 3 feet wide, with steep drops on both sides. I'd read about it in the trail guide, the Blade hikers called it. Exposed to the wind, spectacular views, tricky footing. I'd been looking forward to it, but as I approached, I found a different hiker already standing there, motionless. In the center of the Blade, he was older, late 60s at least, wearing a bright orange rain jacket that seemed almost aggressively visible against the gray October sky. He wasn't looking at the view. He was looking down the western slope, into the dark bowl of forest far below, with the focused, expressionless attention of a man trying to read a sign in a language he almost recognizes. Beautiful spot, I said, because you always say something to other hikers. Trail etiquette, community, the small performance of normalcy. He didn't answer for a long moment. Long enough that I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he turned, and his face was unexpectedly calm. Not peaceful, but calm the way a still pond is calm. The surface smooth and giving nothing away about what moves below. It is, he said. You hiking alone? Yeah. He studied me with eyes the color of weathered wood, pale gray-brown, almost colorless. How far are you going? Crow's Tooth Peak. Camp there tonight. Come back tomorrow. Something moved across his face then. Not alarm exactly. Something more like the look a doctor gives a patient when the test results are back and the news requires a careful arrangement of words. "Stay on the marked trail," he said. "Once you get past mile 9, there'll be a fork that isn't on most maps. The left branch. Don't take it." I almost laughed. Almost? Why not? "Because people who take it," he said, turning back to look at the dark bowl of forest, "don't always come back the same way they went in." I waited for more. A story, a warning, something concrete. But he said nothing else, just stood there on the blades staring into the western dark. And after a moment, I thanked him in a voice that came out slightly thinner than I intended. And I crossed the ridge and continued up the trail. I tried not to think about what he'd said. I was reasonably successful for about 20 minutes, mile 9 of the Calic. Ridge Trail runs through what the guidebook calls Old Growth Transition Zone, which is a technical way of saying that the trees become enormous and the light disappears. I'd been hiking through increasingly dense forest for the last hour, and the sky above me had gone the color of pewter, the early evening light draining from it with October's characteristic indifference. I had maybe 90 minutes before dark. The fork appeared so quietly, I nearly missed it. The main trail continued straight ahead, marked with the familiar blue blazes on the trees. The unmarked branch split off to the left, threading between two massive fir trunks with a kind of dark confidence. It wasn't a game trail, too wide and well-worn for that. It was a real path, just not a mapped one. The ground along it was deeply scoured, packed by the passage of many feet over many years, which only made what the old man had said stranger. People clearly used this trail. People clearly went that way. I stood at the fork for a long moment, pack straps digging into my shoulders, and I listened. The right-hand trail, the marked one, had the usual sounds of a mountain forest in October wind. Creaking boughs, the distant whistle of air over rock. The left-hand trail was quiet. Not silent. There's a difference. Silent is an absence. Quiet is an active thing. The way a room goes quiet when something is being listened to. It was that kind of quiet, attentive, folded, waiting. I took the right-hand trail. Of course I did. I am not an idiot, or I took it for about 400 yards. Then the weather changed. It happened fast enough to be alarming, a curtain of cloud sweeping over the ridge from the northwest, dropping the temperature by 10 degrees in what felt like minutes. The wind picked up, driving the first needles of sleet horizontally through the trees. I had a rain jacket, but the sleet was coming sideways, and the marked trail was heading directly into the wind. My campsite at Crow's Tooth was still 2.2 miles away. In deteriorating weather, uphill. With the light failing, I checked my paper map. I'd printed it the night before, because Marcus had taught me years ago never to trust electronics in the backcountry. The unmarked left fork, based on my estimated position, appeared to loop around the eastern side of the ridgeline and potentially reconnect with the main trail further up. It would get me out of the direct wind. It would possibly shave half a mile off the remaining distance. I told myself this was practical. I told myself the old man's warning was probably a local superstition. It's the kind of thing nervous people attach to unfamiliar places. I told myself a lot of things in the 2 minutes it took me to turn back to the fork and take the left branch. Quiet closed around me like water. The trees on this. The branch of the trail were older, larger, there. Root systems had cracked. The underlying rock and buckled the path so that the ground was uneven and strange, full of gaps and hollows. In the fading light, the hollows looked like open mouths. I told myself to stop thinking in metaphors and pay attention to where I was putting my feet. The trail descended slightly, unexpected, given that I wanted to go up. I checked my compass. The path was curving east, then southeast. Still roughly consistent with the loop I'd imagined. I kept going. It was the smell that stopped me, faint at first, carried on the wind, something organic and wrong. Like soil disturbed too deeply, like the underside of a stone left in still water too long. I'd smelled something similar once before. A deer carcass I'd stumbled onto while hunting with my father years ago. But this was older than that, more diffuse. As though whatever had made the smell had been here long enough to become part of the ground itself. I looked around. The light was going fast now. I clicked on my headlamp, and the beam carved a white tunnel through the trees. In its light, I saw what I hadn't seen in the dimness. The trees along this section of trail were marked, not with blazes or cairns or any human trail marking convention. Each tree on either side of the path had a vertical gouge in its bark, roughly at eye height, maybe 6 inches long. It's cut deeply enough to expose the pale wood beneath. The cuts were old, the exposed wood had darkened. The edges had started to callus over, but they were regular, methodical, consistent. Someone had marked every single tree for as far as my headlamp beam could reach. Not to mark a route. The spacing was wrong for that, too frequent. Almost frantic to mark a boundary. I turned to go back. That was when I realized I couldn't find the way. It's come not because of darkness. I had my headlamp. Not because the trail had vanished. It was still there beneath my feet. The problem was that the trail behind me had forked again, sometime in the last few minutes, without my noticing. I was standing in a small clearing, and 3 paths radiated from it in different directions. They were all equally in the dimming light and sleet. They all looked identical. I stood very still and did the thing every experienced hiker knows to do in the first moment of genuine disorientation. I breathed. 1 breath. 2. The panic that rose was real, bright and physical. Pressure behind my eyes and a loosening in my bowels, but I breathed through it. I checked my compass. I checked my map. I tried to retrace my steps in my memory, to reconstruct which direction I'd been walking, and then I heard the sound. It came from the trees to my left, a slow, rhythmic knocking like a branch striking a trunk in the wind. Except there was no wind in this hollow. The sleet had let up, and the air was completely still. The sound continued. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. It was not a branch. The cadence was too deliberate, too patient. Whatever was producing it was making a choice about when to knock and how many times. My mouth went dry. I chose the middle path at random, the worst kind of decision. I knew it even as I made it, and I walked quickly, then faster, my headlamp swinging. The marked trees on either side of me, with their mute vertical wounds sliding past in the beam. The knocking stopped, which was somehow worse. The path curved, rose, dropped, curved again. The trees pressed close. Their roots reached across the trail like hands. I stumbled once and caught myself on a trunk and felt the bark rough under my palm and told myself out loud, "You're fine. You're a person. You're fine." The sound of my own voice in that silence was the strangest thing I'd ever heard. It didn't echo. It just stopped, absorbed by the dark and the trees, as though the forest had swallowed it whole. I don't know how long I walked. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe. Time behaves differently when fear gets into it, stretching some moments to breaking and compressing others until you can barely account for them. What I know is that at some point, my headlamp beam found a rock formation I recognized. A cluster of dark basalt columns, hexagonal, rising about 12 feet from the forest floor. I'd seen a photograph of these in the trail guide. They were called the Bishops because of the way they tapered at the top. They were on the main trail. I was back on the marked path. I stood there with my hands on my knees, breathing for a long time. Then I looked back at the dark forest behind me. I saw something at the edge of my headlamp beam. Standing very still in the trees, barely visible, a shape, upright, too tall to be a deer, the wrong proportions for a bear. It was there for 1 second, maybe 2, and then it was not there. I've spent a lot of time since then trying to convince myself it was a trick of light and shadow and extreme stress. I have been partially successful. I made camp that night at Crow's Tooth, a wind-scoured hollow behind the peak, and I set up my tent with shaking hands and climbed inside without eating. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the forest below me and told myself that morning would come and I would hike out and none of this would be more than a story. I was half right. Morning did come. But what came with it was something I hadn't planned for. I woke at 3:14 a.m. by the red numerals of my watch. And I woke completely. No grogginess. No slow return from sleep. One moment I was unconscious. The next I was sitting up in my tent, every nerve in my body firing, listening. The sound I'd heard, the sound that had woken me, was the tent fabric moving from outside, not the wind. Wind doesn't touch fabric in one specific spot and then stop. Wind doesn't press, then release. Then press again in the same location with the slow repetition of a finger testing a surface. This was deliberate. Something outside my tent, close right up against the nylon, was pressing into the fabric. Testing it, I did not move. I lay in my sleeping bag and controlled my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, slow, quiet. My headlamp was within reach. My trekking pole was beside the tent door. I had a multi-tool in my hip belt pocket that I could reach without making a sound if I needed it. I want you to understand what it is like to be genuinely afraid in the dark. Not movie afraid, not haunted house, afraid. Real fear, the kind your body was built for, the kind that is millions of years old and knows things your conscious mind has forgotten. Your hearing becomes extraordinary. You can feel your own pulse in places you don't normally notice. Your fingertips, your temples, the backs of your knees. Every instinct you have says, be still, be small. Do not be seen. The pressing on the tent fabric stopped. I heard breathing. Slow, low. I felt more than heard it. A rhythmic displacement of air outside the tent wall. Too large for an animal I could reasonably name. Bears breathe faster. Elk breathe differently. Whatever this was breathed with a terrible deliberateness, as though it was regulating itself, as though it was thinking, then a voice, low, rough, barely above a whisper. Are you lost? Every hair on my body stood upright, not because the question was threatening, because it wasn't. It was delivered with what I can only describe as genuine concern, a soft, careful, almost tender inflection, the way you'd speak to a child you'd found crying. And somehow, that was more terrifying than any threat would have been. The wrongness of it, care, wrapped around something without a human shape. I did not answer. I am not sure I was capable of speech. A long silence. Then the sound of something moving away from the tent, not quickly, not furtively, but with the unhurried confidence of something that has nowhere to be and all the time available. The footsteps, if they were footsteps, did not sound right. Too many of them, or too widely spaced, or both. Then nothing. I lay there until the gray pre-dawn light began to show through the tent fabric. Then I packed my tent in 7 minutes flat, a personal record, and I ate a handful of trail mix while walking because I was not going to stop moving until I was back at my truck, but I had to pass the fork again. I'd been thinking about that on the walk down. The main trail back to the trailhead would take me past mile 9, past the fork, past the section of old growth where I'd gotten turned around. There was no other option. The map showed no alternate route. I would have to go back through it. In daylight, I told myself it would be different. In daylight, with the sun finally breaking through the cloud layer, with birds moving in the canopy and a chickadee somewhere above me running through its repertoire, the forest was less oppressive. The old-growth section was genuinely beautiful, cathedral dark, but not menacing. The massive trunks standing like the pillars of something ancient and indifferent to human. The fork was exactly where I remembered it. The left branch, the unmarked one, looked less sinister in morning light. Just a path. Just trees. I walked past it. I kept my eyes on the marked trail. I moved at a pace just short of jogging. I was 30 yards past the fork when I saw her. A woman, sitting on a log just off the right side of the trail, wearing a red fleece jacket and gray hiking pants. She was maybe 60, with close-cropped silver hair and the weathered, capable look of someone who has spent most of her life outdoors. She had a water bottle in her hand and she was looking at me with the evaluating calm of someone who has been waiting. "You look like you had a rough night," she said. I laughed a short, involuntary sound. Yeah, I did. "Sit down for a minute." "You're going to hurt yourself walking that fast downhill," I almost argued. Instead, I sat. Her name was Dr. Ruth Achebe. She was a forest ecologist. She told me working for the university. She'd been studying old-growth dynamics in this section of the range for 11 years. She camped here 4 times a year, every season. You took the left fork last night, she said. It wasn't a question. I stared at her. How did you? Because you came out from the wrong direction. She nodded up the trail. The bishops are north of your campsite. If you came down from Crow's Tooth the correct way, you'd approach from the east. You came from the north, which means you came out near the bishops. She tilted her head. Which means you went in on the left fork and came out the other end. There's another end? There's always another end. That's not the issue. She looked at me carefully. What did you see? I told her. Everything, the marked trees, the clearing, the shape at the edge of the beam, the voice at the tent. I told her in a flat, factual voice, the way you report a thing you're still not quite sure is real. Because if you put too much emotion into it, the whole structure might collapse. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning her water bottle slowly in her hands. The trees with the vertical cuts, she said. How old did the wounds look? Old years, at least. Some of them maybe decades. She nodded slowly. The local Kalik people marked those trees 3 generations ago. There's stories about that section of forest. I've spent a lot of time talking to their elders. What they describe is consistent across generations. Something in that hollow that has been there a very long time. That is drawn to human distress. That follows, but does not harm. That asks questions. I felt the cold return, different now, not fear exactly, but its aftermath. A slow understanding settling over me. Are you lost? I said quietly. That's what it asks, she said. Always. The same question. And if you answer. She looked at the forest. She was quiet for long enough that I wasn't sure she was going to speak. No one's ever reported what happens if you answer, she said. Because the ones who answer don't tend to come back the same way they went in. The old man's words. Almost verbatim, I sat there on the log in the October sunlight and felt the weight of last night settling into my bones like a cold I hadn't known I'd caught. A jay shrieked somewhere above us and launched itself out of the canopy, and the sound broke the spell, or some of it. Go home, Dr. Echebe said, not unkindly. Come back with someone. Come back in summer. Come back when you're not running from something. I looked at her. How do you know I'm running? Because everyone who ends up on the left fork is running from something, she said. That hollow finds you when you're already lost, not just geographically. You understand the difference? I did understand the difference. It was possibly the most honest thing anyone had said to me in 4 months. I thanked her. I adjusted my pack straps, feeling the familiar pressure of the load as something almost comforting after everything that was unfamiliar. I started down the trail, toward the trailhead. Toward my truck, toward the long drive back to Seattle, and whatever came next. I had gone maybe 20 paces when she called after me. Ethan, I turned. She was still on the log, watching me. I told you I've been coming here for 11 years, she said. I took the left fork. The first time I came, I answered the question. We looked at each other across the morning light and the cold air. I came back the same way I went in, she said. But it took me 3 years to understand that I wasn't the same. She smiled a small, complicated smile, the kind that holds more than one meaning, and turned back to look at the forest. I turned and walked down the mountain. Part 1 was over, but the mountain was not done with me yet. I made the trailhead in under 3 hours. 3 hours is good time on a trail that had taken me most of the previous day going up. But I was moving with the specific, focused urgency of someone who has decided that forward motion is the only acceptable response to an event that the mind is still processing. My legs worked. My boots bit into the trail. 1 foot in front of the other, the oldest, human solution to the problem of being somewhere you don't want to be. My truck was exactly where I'd left it in the gravel pullout at the trailhead. The sight of it, battered gray Tacoma, mud on the wheel wells, a crack in the passenger side mirror that I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, produced in me a profound and embarrassing relief. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the hood, feeling the cold metal under my palm. I just breathed. I threw my pack in the bed and got in. The truck started on the first try, and the heater clanked into life with its familiar rattle. And I sat there with both hands on the wheel and watched the tree line at the edge of the parking area until my heart rate came down below something I could manage. The drive back to Seattle was 4 hours. I stopped for gas and coffee at a small-town station outside Leavenworth. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes drinking the coffee without tasting it. The barista, a teenager with paint-stained fingers and the distracted air of someone mentally elsewhere, had handed me the cup without looking up. The normalcy of it was almost overwhelming. Just a Tuesday. Just a gas station. Just coffee. I called Marcus from the station. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting. "You're out?" he said. Before I could speak, "Yeah, I'm out." "How was it?" I thought about that for a moment. A semi-truck pulled into the station and the rumble of its engine shook the cab of my truck slightly. "Educational," I said. A pause. "Ethan, are you okay?" "I think so. I'll tell you about it when I get back." Another pause. Longer. Marcus was 25, 4 years younger than me, and in many ways more competent, steady, practical. The kind of person who reads instruction manuals before assembling furniture and keeps a first aid kit updated and changes his car's oil on the recommended schedule. But he also knew me better than anyone alive, and there were things my voice did when I was rattled that he could read like a billboard. "I'll be at your place when you get back," he said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." The certainty in his voice was something I wanted to wrap around myself like a coat. "See you tonight." I drove. The mountains receded in my rearview mirror, blue and white and enormous, indifferent to whether I felt better. Outside Skykomish, the Cascades became foothills, and the foothills became suburbs, and the suburbs became Seattle's gray. Rain-damp sprawl, and by the time I crossed over the I-90 bridge and saw the lake spread out below me, dark and ruffled by the wind, I had managed to construct a nearly convincing narrative in which what had happened was simply an unusual night in a strange place and nothing more. I almost believed it, almost because there was one thing I hadn't told Marcus on the phone. One thing I hadn't told Dr. Achebe. One thing I hadn't even fully let myself look at directly. The way you don't look directly at a very bright light, because you know the looking will change something irrevocably. When I'd gotten into my truck at the trailhead, I'd taken off my pack and turned it to get it into the bed. And on the outside of the pack, on the right hip belt strap, the hip belt strap that had been against my body for the entire hike back, there was a mark, a vertical gouge, about 6 inches long, cut clean and deep into the nylon webbing. The kind of mark that takes force. The kind of mark that is deliberate. The kind of mark that matched the ones on the trees. I told no one. I drove. I watched the lake. I breathed. My apartment in Capitol Hill smelled like cold coffee and the particular staleness of rooms that had been occupied by someone who had stopped paying attention. I'd been home for 10 minutes when Marcus arrived, still in his travel clothes from Portland, carrying a paper bag from the Thai place 2 blocks over that we'd been eating at since we were in our early 20s. He took one look at me and said, "Sit down," and I sat. We ate. I told him everything, the old man on the blade, the fork, the marked trees, the clearing, the shape in the beam, the voice at the tent, Dr. Achebe, and what she'd said. I told him about the mark on my pack strap last, and when I did, I could see him choosing, with the deliberate intentionality that Marcus applied to most things, how to respond. He didn't say it was impossible. He didn't say I'd imagined it. He said, "Show me the strap." I showed him. He examined it for a long time, turning the strap over, running his finger along the cut. "This was done with something sharp," he said. "It's not a tear. It's a cut, I know." Put the strap down. He looked at me. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Tell me about this Dr. Achebe." Told him what she'd looked like, what she'd said, the detail about 11 years of field work. He took out his phone and started searching while I talked. After about a minute, he turned the screen toward me. Dr. Ruth Achebe, Associate Professor of Forest Ecology, University of Washington. The faculty photograph showed a woman with close-cropped silver hair and the direct, evaluating gaze I recognized. Real. She was real. Whatever else was uncertain, she was real. She published a paper, Marcus said, scrolling. 2019. Ecological and ethnographic dimensions of old growth. Disturbance in the Northern Cascades. I can't access the full text without a university login, but the abstract. He paused. Reading. The abstract mentions, and I quote, documented indigenous practices of territorial demarcation in the Calic Ridge old-growth corridor, associated with local oral traditions describing a... He stopped. Describing a what? He looked up. He had a very specific expression on his face, the one he got when something had forced him to update his model of reality, and he was still processing the update. Describing a long-term resident entity whose behavior has been consistent across recorded oral history spanning at least 8 generations. Silence. 8 generations. I said, 8 generations. I looked at the cut strap on the table. I thought about the voice, quiet, careful, genuinely concerned. Are you lost? I thought about Dr. Achebo's face when she'd told me she'd answered the question. The 3 years it had taken her to understand she wasn't the same. What do you think it does? Marcus asked. To the ones who answer. I don't know, I said. And then, more honestly, I'm not sure it's a what. That night, I slept without dreaming for the first time in 4 months. I want to emphasize that, because I think it matters. After everything I'd experienced on that mountain, I came home and I slept deeply, completely, dreamlessly, and I woke in the morning feeling something I hadn't felt since Alina left. Something I had to think about for a moment before I recognized it. Present. I felt present. In my body, in my apartment, in the specific texture of this particular Tuesday morning in October. Not happy exactly. Not healed, but here. Genuinely. Unambiguously here. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about Dr. Achebe saying, it finds you when you're already lost. It's not just geographically. And I thought about what it means to answer a question honestly. The question had been, are you lost? I hadn't answered. But somewhere in those hours on the mountain, the fear and the dark and the forest that swallowed my voice, I had stopped being able to lie to myself about the answer. I had been lost. Profoundly, genuinely lost. Not on the trail, but in the specific way that grief makes you a stranger to yourself. And whatever the thing in the forest was creature, spirit, echo, manifestation of something very old in the land it had, by simply existing in a way that was undeniable and immediate, forced me back into my body. Into the present tense, I got up and made coffee. Real coffee in the actual coffee maker, not instant. I called my sister in Portland and talked to her for 40 minutes. I took a shower that lasted long enough to use up the hot water. I ate breakfast sitting at the table by the window, watching the rain move across the rooftops. These sound like small things. They were not small. 3 weeks after I came back from the mountain, a small package arrived at my apartment. My name and address were written on it in careful, deliberate handwriting on a plain white label. No return address. The postmark read, Leavenworth. Wah. I opened it at the kitchen table, slowly. The way you open things when you suspect they might change something. Inside was a small, flat piece of wood, a section of tree bark, dark brown, maybe 4 inches long and 2 inches wide. On it, someone had carved a simple design, 2 parallel vertical lines, like the boundary marks on the trees, but between them, a smaller mark, a single horizontal line, bisecting both verticals. Not the same as the tree marks. A different symbol, related but distinct. Beneath the bark, there was a single card. On it, in the same careful handwriting as the address, Dr. Ruth Achebe's name, her university email, her office phone number. And below that, 5 words, when you're ready. I'll explain. I turned the bark over. On the reverse side, carved smaller, but just as carefully, was a word. Seife held it for a long time. Then I took out my phone and dialed the office number. She answered on the 3rd ring. I wondered if you'd call, she said, without preamble, as though she'd been waiting. The bark, I said. Yes. What does the symbol mean? Crossed boundary, she said. In Calic notation, it means someone passed through the marked territory and returned. The single horizontal line means she paused, choosing her words. It means witnessed. You were witnessed and found to be another pause. Honest. In your distress. In your fear. In your being lost. I thought about the long night in my tent. The thing pressing against the fabric. The question. It left me a mark, I said. On my pack strap? I know. The same symbol. Smaller. The first mark. It means seen. And the bark is from one of the marked trees. The Calic elders asked me to send it when I told them about you. It's a kind of acknowledgement. You went into a place you shouldn't have. You encountered something very old. Didn't answer the question, but your fear was honest. Your distress was real, and you came back. Silence. They wanted you to know that. I looked at the carved piece of bark in my hand. It was very light, for something that felt so heavy. Dr. Achebe, I said, when you answered the question, what happened? A long pause. I was 34 years old, she said. First year in the field. I just lost my father. I walked into that hollow at dusk because I wasn't paying attention. Because grief does that. It narrows your field of vision until you stop seeing things right in front of you. And it asked me, are you lost? She took a breath, and I said yes. The rain moved across my window. A car passed on the street below, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt. What happened then? I stood in that hollow in the dark for a very long time, she said. And whatever it is, I've been studying it for 11 years, and I still don't have a name that fits. It stayed with me. It didn't touch me. It didn't threaten me. It was just there, present, in the way that very old things are present, without judgment, without agenda. Just witnessing. She paused. And after a while, I realized I was crying. And after a while after that, I stopped. And I walked out of the hollow on the path I'd come in, and the stars were out. And I could breathe. I said nothing. It took me 3 years to understand, she said, that I hadn't experienced something that needed to be feared. I'd experienced something that needed to be respected. There's a difference. What is it? I asked. What does the forest have in it? Something old, she said. Something that has been in that hollow since before the first people came through that pass. Based on the geological evidence and the oral histories, something that is drawn to human pain the way water is drawn downhill, not to feed on it, not to harm. Just to, she searched for the word, attend, to be present with it, to witness it without looking away. I sat with that for a while. Is that why it asks if you're lost? The Calic interpretation, she said, is that it's not asking for information. It already knows. It's asking you to hear yourself say it. I looked at the carved bark in my hand. I looked at the word saf. Thank you, I said. Come back, she said. In summer, I'll take you to the hollow properly. In daylight, with preparation, with an elder from the community who knows the protocol. It's worth seeing. Said I would think about it. I put down the phone and sat at the table and listened to the rain. After a while, I opened my laptop and started a document and began typing this account. Not because I think it will explain anything definitively, or because I want anyone to believe or disbelieve it. Because Dr. Achebe was right about one thing. There's something profoundly clarifying about hearing yourself say the true thing. I went back in July. Marcus came with me this time. So did Dr. Achebe, and so did Thomas Swiftwind, an elder of the Calic community, quiet man in his 70s who walked the trail with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows exactly where every root is and has for 60 years. Thomas didn't say much on the way up. He didn't need to. His presence on the trail was itself a kind of instruction. The mountain in July was unrecognizable from the mountain I'd encountered in October. The old-growth forest was full of light, filtered green gold through the canopy in great tilting shafts. The undergrowth was thick and varied huckleberry, vine maple bunchgrass, the small white stars of trillium already gone to seed. Birds were everywhere, warblers, vireos, the liquid fluting of thrushes from deep in the shade. The blade in summer light was genuinely breathtaking. the view to the west opening into 100 miles of mountain range, blue and white and immense. We stopped there for water, and Thomas spoke for the first time about the hollow. He spoke for about 10 minutes, quietly, in the particular way of someone sharing something that has weight and needs to be set down carefully. What he said. In summary, the entity in the hollow, which in Calic the word for it translates roughly as the old witness, has been part of the oral tradition for as long as the tradition exists. It does not harm. It is never harmed. But it is drawn to human distress, and it asks its question. And what it does with the answer, with the act of a person acknowledging their own lostness, is something that the tradition describes as returning the person to themselves, not fixing them, not healing them, just reflecting them back to themselves, clearly, without distortion. Like a mirror, Marcus said. Thomas smiled a small, patient smile. Like a very old mirror, he said, that has seen a lot of faces. We continued up the trail. At the fork, Thomas paused and performed a brief, quiet ritual, a specific gesture with both hands. And words in Calic that Dr. Achebe later told me were a kind of greeting and acknowledgement. Then he stepped onto the left branch and we followed in July daylight. The hollow was beautiful. That's the thing I want you to understand. In October darkness, in fear and disorientation, in the specific vulnerability of a person who is running from grief. It had been terrifying. In July light, with preparation and company, and the right framing, it was one of the most beautiful places I had ever seen. The marked trees stood in a wide ring, their vertical cuts healed over the years to dark, furrowed seams, like the kind of scar that has become part of the architecture of a face. The clearing in the center was carpeted with soft moss. Beams of sunlight came through the canopy at steep angles, shifting as the wind moved the branches, making the whole space seem to breathe. We sat in the clearing for about an hour. Thomas told us about 3 generations of his family who had come to this place in times of difficulty, about his grandmother, who had sat here for a night when her son was dying and had come out in the morning with something settled in her that had been turbulent for years, about his own first visit at 16. Running from something he was no longer willing to name. I told them Marcus, Ruth, Thomas, what I'd been running from. Not the surface version, the carefully edited one I'd given Marcus in October. The real version, the specific ways Elena's leaving had made me feel that my judgment was fundamentally broken, that the self I'd constructed was a fiction, that I was, at my core, someone who could not be loved for long. The grief that had disguised itself as general life dissatisfaction. The drinking I'd been minimizing. The way I'd come to this mountain, not to find something, but to exhaust myself, enough that I didn't have to feel it. I said it all clearly. Into the light and the moss and the standing ring of ancient trees. Nobody fixed it. Nobody argued with my assessment or offered reframes or listed my good qualities. Marcus put his hand briefly on my shoulder and then took it away. Ruth nodded. Thomas looked at the trees. The forest was quiet. The good kind of quiet, the attentive kind, the kind that is listening. We ate lunch. We talked about other things, the ecology of the old growth, the watershed, the species of lichen growing on the north sides of the trees. Thomas told a long, funny story about a bear that had repeatedly raided his family's camp over the course of 3 summers. Marcus found a perfect obsidian arrowhead in the soil near the clearing's edge, and we all looked at it and put it back exactly where it was. On the way out of the hollow, I paused at the tree nearest the entrance, one of the largest. Its bark so deeply furrowed, it was like a landscape in miniature. I put my hand on it. The bark was warm from the afternoon sun, warm and rough and alive in the way that very old living things are alive, with a complexity that goes far beyond what you can see. I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure words were the right instrument, but I thought I was lost, and I'm finding my way back. And I know the difference now between the 2 states, which means I know which direction to walk. Something shifted in the tree. Not movement, more like the cessation of a tension I hadn't been aware of. The bark was warm under my palm. The birds were singing. The light came down in long, slow shafts through the canopy. I took my hand away and walked out of the hollow into the summer forest. My brother beside me, the old witness behind me, And the trail, the marked trail, is my own trail ahead. I spent a long time thinking about what to make of what happened on that mountain. I'm a person who likes explanations that fit neatly into frameworks I already have. I like to know what something is so I can decide what to do about it. I don't have that kind of certainty about the Calic Ridge Hollow. I don't know what lives there. Entity, spirit, echo, ancient consciousness, something for which we don't yet have a word. I don't know why it's drawn to human distress, or what it does with the answers to its question, or whether what Dr. Achebe experienced and what I experienced and what the Calic oral tradition describes are all accounts of the same thing, or of different aspects of a thing too. Large to see whole. What I know is this. I went into a dark forest while I was running from something I wasn't willing to name. I encountered something very old that asked me a question I wasn't willing to answer. I came back frightened and shaken and marked. And the mark, whatever it was, however it happened, was not a wound. It was a notation. It meant seen. Being seen, it turns out, is not nothing. Grief tries to make you invisible to yourself and to the world. It wraps you in a narrative about your own unworthiness until you forget that there's a difference between being in pain and being broken. What happened to me on that mountain in the dark, in the fear, in the long, unreasonable night of something pressing against my tent and asking if I was lost, didn't cure any of that. But it burned away the performance, the careful management of how much I was willing to admit, the curated version of my own suffering that I'd been presenting to the world and, more damagingly to myself. I was lost. I said it eventually, not to the thing in the dark, but to myself, to Marcus, to a clearing in the summer forest with sunlight coming through the canopy and moss under my boots. Finding begins with that. Just that, the word for where you actually are. I still think about the shape at the edge of my headlamp beam. I still hear, in quiet moments, the deliberate rhythmic knock from the dark trees. These are not comfortable memories. I don't want them to be comfortable. I think the discomfort is part of what they're for. A reminder that the world is large, enough to contain things I don't understand. That the forest keeps its own counsel. There are questions more important than whether you can answer them. My brother drives up to hike with me twice a month now. We've been on 8 trails since July. We're planning a 4-day trip next spring into the enchantments, the whole Alpine Lakes traverse. Technical and beautiful and thoroughly beyond my current fitness level, which is precisely why I've started training for it. I don't drink anymore. Not a moral stance, I just found, sometime around November, that I didn't want to. I got a new hip belt for my pack. But I kept the old one, the one with the cut strap, the one with the mark. It's in a drawer in my desk. Sometimes I take it out and hold it. It's very light for something that heavy. The cut in the nylon has not frayed further. The edges are clean. The cut is exactly 6 inches long, seen, that's what it means. Not haunted, not cursed, not damaged. Seen, if you go to Calic Ridge, and it is genuinely one of the most beautiful trails in the Northern Cascades. And I genuinely recommend it. Stay on the marked trail. Bring someone you trust. Come when you're not running from anything, and if you find yourself at the fork, the unmarked left branch, threading between the massive firs at mile 9, make the right choice. The right choice is the marked trail. The right choice is home. But if you're already lost when you get there, if you're lost in the way that has nothing to do with geography, the way that is about all the miles you've put between yourself, who you actually are, then know this. The forest is very old. Older than fear, older than grief, older than the story you've been telling yourself about, why you can't be found. It has been listening for a long time. It is still listening now. The end.